Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is David Baker. You may have seen this profile picture a bunch. This one's a little more current. I run a small team of Ember-focused developers, full-stack devs. I've been building websites since the late 90s in high school, but I've kind of grown up with the web here over the last decade or two. Been working with Ember since 2014. Was Ember core for from 2015 to 2020, overlapped with Chris Manson for a while there. Generally, you'll find me online with Acorn.com, and currently based in Saudi Arabia. The tech industry is booming here. Was in Boulder, Colorado before that. So today we'll be taking a look at focus issues, kind of the snags that come up in accessibility when trying to use keyboard. And oftentimes when we think about accessibility, we're thinking about screen readers, but it's actually a major headache if you're trying to use a keyboard and focus keeps jumping around on the screen. And so in the Audit Board app, it's a large enterprise app, kind of looking at this from a component library design system perspective, where the goal is to build the thing to be used by other developers, but they may need to be able to do additional overrides. And so we'll be looking at a focus management library that was quite useful. And so in this app that we are working on, it's one of the larger Ember apps in the ecosystem, 10 plus years old, lots of developers in the system historically and presently. jQuery is still in active use. There's a growing demand for accessibility from our clients, major Fortune 500 companies, government institutions, really interested in seeing the accessibility grow. And so over the last year or so, we've been working on helping address a number of accessibility issues. One of those, as we sorted out sort of the basics aspects of DOM issues, things like that, one of the key things that really started being a nuisance and annoying was keyboard navigation. And the persona that we kind of ended up viewing this through wasn't someone who's blind. They're kind of looking at the website through a structured list type of view of the world, not exclusively. That's, I think about it. But thinking about this, somebody who might be paralyzed, paraplegic, they're in a wheelchair, they can go forward and back, they can press return, push tab, but they don't have a lot of keyboard control. And if you try and navigate a lot big, complex SPAs with that paradigm, it gets really frustrating. Trying to tab your way to something you can see and being blocked by developers who weren't thinking about that aspect because they're used to using a keyboard is painful. So I built a small sample system here that kind of shows the types of snags we might run into. Generally, you start in the top unless you're doing a presentation like this. And you can push tab and move around the screen. Works fairly well. This is using Ember Bootstrap, and it is a good stand-in for the type of design library we're already working with. Number of pieces around focus already built and handled nicely. So click on About, get a modal. In this particular app, there were multiple modals, so you might trigger another modal in this or use select drop-downs where they'd pop up another modal, power select, things like that. But overall concept being that you can tab around and close this. And this is quite nice. Focus moves back to where you would expect it to be. So we were on About, we push enter. We want to go back to where we were before. But here's an example of something that doesn't tend to get handled in this type of focus scenario. Close this. My focus just got lost. If I push tab, I don't know where my focus is. And actually, we'll see if we can figure it out. It moved clear down to the bottom of the screen. This is a nuisance. Losing focus without even being able to see it or figure out where I am and then trying to figure out how to get back to where I was is kind of what we're talking about today. Yep, focus just got lost there again. And how do you solve this? The reality is it's pretty hard to solve that using just components or components and modifiers. Um, and so if we take a look here, as we think about this, and as we talked with folks at Audit Board, the reality is most component libraries, Bootstrap here is a good example. You're thinking about, okay, if the modal opens up, we want focus trapped inside of it. We don't want it moving around. And then we want to restore focus to the element we came from. But what happens if that element isn't there? Effectively, you kind of need a history, a service of some kind, keeping track of where focus has been moving around on the screen over time and helping you kind of resolve things as that is no longer the case. You need a history and you need to be able to skip backwards if some of those DOM elements have disappeared. In a design library, you also need overrides where app developers can take the base case and do different things and do that relatively easily. And that can get tricky. So as we researched and looked around, there's a number of people who are handling different pieces, but a larger toolbox was hard to find. The one we ended up finding was called Tabster, developed by Microsoft. And many of the things I just described were things that it could handle. It builds a focus overlay run through the whole app, adds a focus event handler, and pays close attention to all tab events, arrow key events that occur within the app. It's kind of a holistic toolbox designed for larger enterprises who are dealing with this type of problem. Its primary interface for control is DOM-based. Uses a mutation observer under the hood to pay attention to the DOM as it changes and update its internal state. But that works pretty nicely with Glimmer components, Ember components. As you modify those DOM elements and the config, it can actually reflect into Tabster. Tabster offers event handling for overrides and special cases, which works pretty well. And the license is MIT. It's developed on GitHub. That said, it's being used in real world situations on some of Microsoft's largest properties. They're busy sorting out things related to right to left in use in Arab scenarios like in the Middle East. So it's been pretty battle tested. That said, DOM updates that Tabster initiates as far as focus goes are using set timeout, which isn't really tied into Glimmer in any way, shape, or form. We didn't hit any problems with it, and it's in production at the moment, but could see there being potential wrinkles to that. There's a RFC 957 around scheduler improvements to Ember that in theory, Tabster could get tied into quite nicely, but Tabster is not currently architected for extensibility much at all. So that could lead to some wrinkles. It's primarily used by Microsoft, and their team wasn't responsive to questions on GitHub much at all. So there were some wrinkles to it, but for our purposes, it worked great. So we'll take a look at some of the core components in Tabster. Its core primary focus system, its modalizer system. They use some kind of cute names, make it a little harder to understand sometimes. And they're deloser, which are effectively focus layers in history, and you can just wipe them out. So there's a whole bunch of movement in this modal. When the modal goes away, its history layer goes away, and then we've moved down a layer. They've got a mover that handles keyboard movement. So yeah, let's dig in here a little. In pursuing Tabster, there's a couple options as far as how you dig in and migrate into something like this. This is a simple setup, kind of shows the base initialization of how you need to initialize. Somewhere you have to initialize it somehow, and then you'll call Tabster. Fairly basic, need to dispose it at the end. Let's see here. And so there's two migration strategies you can take to getting into Tabster. One is kind of an islands of richness approach where you want this one watched by Tabster and everything inside this element, but you really don't want this sidebar or that Chrome handled at all. The other one, oh yeah, and this, oh. And you can do things like use modifiers to control this, which makes it much simpler. So instead of having to do Tabster elements and all the JSON stringify stuff in DOM, you can just drop it in right here. And that worked great for us. Let's see. Second option is to go full on Tabster overlay. And in this scenario, you're going to need to initialize the body of the app. And then in the midst of it, you may find that you want to specifically skip and do what Tabster calls uncontrolled elements, where these aren't fiddled with. Tab events don't have any impact here. And that's quite handy in certain scenarios. So once you've got it all set up, congratulations, your Axe tests now fail. If you're not aware of these things, Axe is a accessibility testing suite built into a number of tools. It's used in Ember ALI, A11Y testing. It's used in Ember Lighthouse. There's a lot of Chrome extensions that use it to kind of test the DOM in your app and kind of see if it's base level accessibility or base accessible. But it's not great to have those tests immediately start failing. Some clients use it as a means of testing and seeing whether this app is truly something that meets spec and guidelines around various certifications. What's going on here? Well, if you think back about that uncontrolled component that we just looked at, Tabster annotates either uncontrolled components or your entire body element by adding I elements that are specifically designed to allow Tabster to understand where your focus is. If you've just tabbed into this uncontrolled component, in theory, it might be able to understand that. But what happens if you tab out or shift tab out? Tabster needs to know where your focus is. So these are known or have been called focus bumpers. Your focus moves to one of these I elements, and then Tabster promptly moves focus on from them to where it should go. But we ran into an amusing case working with one of their larger clients, Microsoft, where we were getting failures reported about problems in this app by Microsoft employees about a library that had been written by Microsoft employees, and had a whole series of discussions that we found where these Microsoft employees were busy discussing whether these are truly failures or not. So the end result was these aren't really failures. It is okay to proceed to use it, but be forewarned that if you do use this, you may actually get flagged for accessibility failures that you didn't have before. Kind of wild. So here's the same app tabsterized. We've done a few things here. One is I'm using arrows to move back and forth here now. This is common practice, good practice. You can build that yourself if you do it carefully with a given component. But Tabster's got some easy ways to just add that to sidebars, menus, things like that for movement. So we can tab once, hit this sidebar, tab again, and move around again. Here's our same modal. This time I've moved focus to the password thing. We'll talk about that in detail a bit further. But you can set focus to move to a different place in the screen as kind of a default, and then still override that behavior if you desire to move it somewhere else, depending on your use case. And here again is our modal. If we close this thing that has a trap focus set, we can't get out of it right now. This layer of focus that we've now set up for this modal closes, and now our focus properly goes back to where it came from. And here we are in the table. I'm using arrow keys to move around instead of tab, which makes it a lot faster to go down. In this particular example, it's 3 columns, not a big deal. If this were 20 columns, tabbing your way through this table becomes a nightmare. Now, the other thing that's nice about this is if I push Shift Tab, I jump out. I can tab to the table, and I can tab past the table down here. So you can very quickly make it a lot easier to move around and maybe even avoid skip links with making it far more usable. So, okay, it's nice to see that and have me say that we did something there. What actually went on there? Well, in this particular part, we set up a Tabster root, and we set up a deluser layer, a history layer for the whole app. That kind of gives us the history that we need that we can then use for further things. We set up a mover on the sidebar, and all of these data tabsters can be set up with modifiers, and highly recommend doing so. We set up a mover on the sidebar, which made it a lot easier to move around there. Set up another mover on the table, this one with a set of a different direction thing. If you're doing this in JavaScript or TypeScript, you can actually get names. This is the grid direction, which allows movement in any direction versus just left, right, up, or down. And then we did some things to the modal. Now this gets a little more complicated, but this code here replaces many of the trap focus modifiers that exist and are very useful in other scenarios. Here, we set up a modalizer, which initializes a different module of Tabster, gave our modal a name and trapped focus within the modal. And then we set up another focus layer within the modal so that all history that happened in there could be used to understand where things were. There are also different strategies for focus restoration that can be applied at a per focus layer level. The final step to setting up this modal down here is focusing within the element, which then puts our focus in the trapped focus section of the modal. Once the modal is loaded, and I'm not showing where this action gets called, once the modal loads, we then want to do something, or we wouldn't have to, but we can do whatever we want and use imperative API calls from the Tabster library to do further things. And the sky's the limit at this point. In this particular example, we're wanting to focus on the default attribute, or if an element has default, like down here, we want focus to go on this particular thing, but that could be anywhere in the modal, or we could have several. This type of thing can be really handy for focus within sidebars active links, that type of thing as well. So we're just touching the surface of what Tabster's imperative API allows, but it gives you quite a bit of flexibility for inspecting the DOM, moving around, choosing different elements, mapping over them, things like that. So that's a quick snapshot of what's available in Tabster. I actually went faster here than I expected. There are more complex things in here that we're not actually going to cover tonight. The biggest one here is around event behavior modification for Tabster, and that's almost a separate talk. Tabster emits events when it's in the midst of desiring to change things. So if it's about to move focus somewhere, it'll tell you and you can cancel it or redirect, inject your own behavior there. You also have the ability to move Tabster's focus by emitting an event that Tabster is listing for. And so you can use your own API to control Tabster without necessarily moving focus manually if that's important for your use case. This isn't something we needed to get into, but Tabster does allow cross-origin iframe navigation. So if you tab into an iframe, that iframe can have an app that also has Tabster in it, and the two Tabsters can be set up to talk to each other and allow seamless tabbing back and forth. Complicated, don't know all the inner workings of that, but it's there if it's needed. And there's quite a number of other pieces under the hood in Tabster that are not documented. That's probably my biggest critique of this library. If you want to use it well, you need to go study the tests. The code, the tests, that becomes the thing that you need. There's a decent amount of things that are only loosely touched on in the docs. So final thoughts. Classic Ember talks about, hey, well, here's an add-on to use it. Though that's less the case these days as we've got Ember Auto Import. I have this registered. I don't really know if it's necessary. As you saw, most of the things around focus here were modifier based, and that may be something that people want to control on an app by app basis, but it may be something that we want to collaborate on as a community and kind of build out a base set of simple modifiers that can be used. But that's about all I have for tonight. If you need help with some of this type of stuff, if we trigger thoughts around crazy focus things you need help with, do let me know. And with that said, are there any questions about what we just talked about?
First of all, thanks, David. Really nice talk. Interesting topic, I think, right? And I guess most people, most of the time, don't get sort of the budget or the permission to like spend the time that they should spend on that topic. So I think it's very good to see sort of what you can do when you can, like I assume spend like quite some time on this to build all this.
Yep.
I think we have one question by Julien. Tabs has 70K, if I'm correct. Is it possible to only load parts of it?
It wasn't that large. I think last time I checked it, it was 30K. And that was gzip versus Brotli. It's designed to be tree shakeable. So the goal is for it to only be modules that you use. In our specific use case, we ended up using almost every module that existed. So it probably depends on the size of the app you're building and what the bundle size is. But yeah, if you've got a few simple focus things, I would recommend something smaller, a lighter trap focus modifier. But if this is really key to your app, worth digging in on.
Yeah. And I had a question as well related to testing. Do you have tests for sort of tab navigation? And
So
because I guess it would be good, but also they might be a little brittle, right?
that was the worst part about it. Focus testing. So if you're operating Ember tests on your local machine, it works fine. If you're not clicked in the browser console. But if you're running Ember exam, not all those windows are focused at the same time. And so you get flakiness. So we had to shift focus testing from Ember into PageWrite or Playwright. And it's like, oh, this is a nuisance. Now I saw something earlier today in Chrome in the console. Let me see if I can find that. That made it look like you might be able to start controlling whether Chrome was focused or not, or considered itself focused, but focus testing is painful. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And then, I mean, for the tests themselves, would you sort of like would the test be render the component, press tab, press arrow down, arrow down,
yeah.
arrow down, and then sort of assert your own specific element, or
Yeah. It depends. What we ended up doing was we would set focus close to where we were after and then test aspects of it. Part of what we did, which I didn't talk about here, was we were effectively taking a table component and turning it into Excel. So you're able to navigate it with a keyboard, press enter, edit cells. Some of that was already in the table, but we were kind of making it even more advanced where you could shift tab to the header, adjust the filters, shift or tab right back to where you were, to the point that it felt like power tools where you could just work with the table live. And I stopped wanting to use my mouse and keyboard or my mouse and just use the keyboard because it did give that level of control. And that's where it starts feeling like this isn't purely accessibility. This is also, oh, we have quite a bit of control and it can actually enable better workflows. But
yeah.
is it the right use of payload for your app? Depends on what you need. Yeah, I was just looking in Chrome DevTools. There's a recent thing under hover, emulate a focused page. I first saw it today. So I don't know if that would work in an Ember exam scenario where you could somehow turn that on with Chrome and just go, no, I want all these to run simultaneously. But it was painful to have to switch out of Ember tests into something else that made it harder to test.
Yeah. Another question, Ember Primitives is using it as well. Should Ember Focus use Ember Primitives under the hood?
Yeah, I saw Preston had started adding Tabster to Ember primitives after some of this work that we did. Possible, haven't got that far. But yeah, it's kind of the early stages. And as you see, most of those modifiers can just be applied using simple ones yourself. So is there really a need for an Ember focused library as a community? Not sure. But if we find that so many, I've only seen Audit Board use Tabster so far, and then there's somebody else poking at it a few weeks ago. So if the community ends up feeling like, yeah, Tabster's great, then maybe we work on it more. But that payload size, not everyone's going to want to pay it. So I think we have to be careful that it doesn't get into the whole community for everything.
Yeah, but I guess that's always the trade-off for everything, essentially, right? Like,
Yep.
what's your requirements? What are the options? How much do they cost? Like,
Yep.
do you want to make the investment, right?
Yep.
Great, cool.